Welcome everyone to our hot stove meeting to talk about the Hall of Fame and the Tigers off season. Apologies again for all the technical difficulties and delays, but I think we're ready to roll. And we're going to start out by talking about the Hall of Fame. We have three members of our chapter leadership who are all experts on the Hall of Fame or certain Hall of Famers or Hall of Fame candidates or all of the above. Dan Diodana, Mitch Lutzke, and Gary Gillette. Mitch, let's start with you. Let's talk about in this new class of Hall of Famers, one of the early pioneers of 19th century baseball, Bud Fowler, has gotten in. And he's a person that you researched as part of your Michigan notable book on the Page Fence Giants. Could you give us an overview of what you think got Bud Fowler into the Hall of Fame? And also tell us a bit about his connections to Adrian, his time in Adrian.
Yeah, I'm repping my Lansing Lugnut Page Fence Giants retro jersey that they wore in June when they put the Page Fence Giants in the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame. So, yeah, I was shocked, stunned, happy that Bud Fowler finally got his recognition. As to why, after all this time, well, I think efforts of SABR and people that kept his name alive over the years. I mean, Mike Neal did a movie from Adrian College that I was in. He started it, I don't know, about 6 or 8 months after I started my research. There was a book on Fowler, I think in 2013. I think it was Mike Lang's book. People had written some pieces over the years, a little bit about the Page Fence Giants. Leslie Heapy had written one, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. I know that Gary Gillette was a Bud Fowler guy because when I went to my first SABR meeting, he's like, oh, you're the guy I want to meet who's writing about the Page Fence Giants. So I think there were a lot of people here and there that understood that he was a major professional baseball player who happened to be African-American at a time when baseball was starting out. And I also think that some of the modern, like WAR and numbers, even though he didn't have any, I think maybe in a way that might have helped him because you could reiterate to people that you weren't able to place him on a timeline of data, of numbers, because the numbers were not captured at that time for various reasons. One being there wasn't that robust, media coverage. 2, he traveled a lot. In the video on Mike Neal, I called Bud Fowler a tumbleweed of baseball. He just blew through communities and was usually run out of communities because he was, the best player taking a white person's job. People are nervous, he's in town and such. But I think the lack of numbers also pointed out that you're going to have to go to kind of plan B to look at these pre-1900 baseball players and start researching things like quotes people said about them or comparative, that we thought we had the greatest team, but Bud Fowler was, 3 times better than our best player. These types of anecdotes, I think, actually got more weight because there was not a numbers timeline evidence. So I think the void was filled by people who had seen him play and who knew about his historical contributions. And that's just, that would be if somebody said, why all of a sudden? And many hands make light work. So I think everybody's little bit here and there at SABR conferences, my book, Mike's video, the Fowler book, various article pieces, and I think that all went together and put Bud, rightly so, in the Baseball Hall of Fame in the community he grew up in, Cooperstown, New York.
And tell us briefly, although his time in Adrian might be, I mean, as you said, he had a number of different stops along the way. And so it's not that his stint in Adrian put him over the top or anything, but tell us a little bit about that stint that he had here in Michigan.
Well, Bud had 2 stays, long-term stays in Michigan. He was one of the best players in 1889 for the Greenville team in a minor league team in Michigan. And I wrote about that. It was in the Michigan History magazine a couple of years ago about the whole 1889 league, which was integrated. There were a couple of other African-American ball players as well. And so then he traveled around. He went out to Kansas and And then he came back to Findlay, Ohio, which was an integrated team, the Findlay Sluggers. And he played there in 1893. I believe he was on the team at the end of the year. There's some discussion there, but he was definitely on the team in 1894 with Grant Homerun Johnson, the African-American slugger, who was also on the finalist ballot that put Bud Fowler in a few days ago. And so they were a traveling semi-pro team. A couple of their white pitchers made it to the major leagues and kind of had some decent careers, but they would travel around the Midwest. Well, Adrian in 1894 had self-proclaimed themselves the baseball capital of Michigan, even though they had lost 2 out of 3 games to Monroe and 2 out of 3 games to, I believe it was Pontiac. They were really gaga about baseball, much more so than I think you could argue even Detroit. So when the local boosters in Adrian in the summer of 1894 were looking for a team to beat their light guard Armory team, which George Wilson was on, the left-handed pitcher, African-American from Palmyra, just down the road, Fowler, Johnson, and this troop showed up, and they beat the Adrian, Michigan team quite badly, like by double digits both times, but they drew thousands and thousands of fans to both games. At that time, Fowler had given during his stay, and this would have been in August of 1894, he'd given lengthy interviews to the Adrian papers about planning a team the following year, an all-black traveling team, as we called like the Western Colored Tourist or something like that. And he was going to base it at Findlay, but it.
Hold on a second, Mitch. You went on mute for just a second. Trying to unmute you now.
Okay, we'll whistle.
Okay, am I good?
Okay, all right, yep, go ahead.
Yep. So I don't know where I was cut off, but the Findlay Sluggers were lured to Adrian to play the Light Guard Armory team and won 2 big games with really huge and enthusiastic crowds. And Fowler, in his interview and apparently talking to people, said that he was going to put a traveling Negro or colored baseball team together in 1895, and he was going to base it in Findlay. But after what he had seen in Adrian, if they could guarantee him a $500 season profit, he would locate the team in Adrian. And a month later, on September 21st, 1894, both the daily newspapers in Adrian blared the headline that the Page Fence Giants were going to be Bud Fowler's new team. He moves in early October to Adrian, Michigan from Findlay. He becomes a barber, or that's his off-season vocation. He cuts hair at Reed and Craig's on downtown Adrian, and then writes baseball players across the country. And he helps organize the team with Grant Homerun Johnson, and then 3 white co-owners, Len Hawk, a former mayor, and the Taylor brothers, 2 business people, owned hardware sporting goods store. And they put together the Page Fence Giants, and they traveled. But Bud left in June of 1895. There was a shakeup earlier in that month that Johnson and Fowler were no longer members of the management team, but were going to be salaried players. And then Bud left a couple of weeks after that decision was announced. He played 1 game with the Adrian Demons at second base, and then he left and played for the Lansing Senators, the minor league team in the MSL, for another month, and then he left. So his stay in Adrian was about October to June or so, 1894 to 1895, but he was well known throughout baseball. I mean, if you were talking about baseball pioneers in the 1890s, people knew who Bud Fowler was.
So Dan and Gary, that's leads to my next question about what does it take to get a 19th century pioneer in 2021? And but Mitch's point is well taken that although it would be very presumptuous for SABR to take too much of a victory lap to say SABR members put him here, nonetheless, efforts such as Mitch's and other researchers continue to shed new light on some of these old stories. But either Dan or Gary, what do you think? What put Bud over the top, and how do you mark this moment for his legacy?
Dan, you want to go first? Sure. Well, I think it definitely helped that there were SABR members on the voting panel. So they really did a good job of getting experts in that era of baseball. So for those of you who don't know, the committees are separated by eras now. After players drop off the writer's ballot, there's the early game, which is baseball from its origins up to integration, and then the golden era, which is from integration to expansion, and then the modern day, which is like, expansion to 1987 or 8, and then the today's game, which is the one that'll be voted on next year, and it'll have guys like Fred McGriff on it. So I think that having the experts definitely helped, and having them split it into eras definitely helped. One of the biggest factors in just getting notoriety was having the Negro Leagues declared a major league. I think that brought a new outlook for a lot of people that didn't really look the same way, and now statistics are blended in and everything. So it got an interest in people looking at the Negro Leagues, but also just looking at pioneers in baseball. With this ballot, there's the pioneer category, and I think that really was the driving force, there, because the interest in the Negro Leagues across baseball is continuing to grow, and I think that having that and having Negro Leagues experts and early Black baseball experts on the panel really did the trick.
Gary, your thoughts on that? So the point about, the Negro Leagues becoming major leagues, that era was defined as 1920 to 1948, thinking that would elevate players of that period as one benefit of that. But maybe the rising tide lifted all boats, including players such as Fowler.
Well, it did and it didn't. I mean, Cannonball Redding didn't get in, and if there's anybody outside the Hall of Fame who deserves to be in there, it's Cannonball Redding. I'm not just including Black players; I'm including white players. And Dick Lundy wasn't even on the ballot. So the Hall is playing a numbers game. They don't want to see what some people call the cattle call, the 2006 induction of 17 people. So they don't want to see that. So they're severely restricting the supply of candidates to 10, and then they're restricting the demand by saying you can only vote for 4. Well, while it's theoretically possible for a committee of 16 people needing 12 votes to approve a candidate for induction to elect 5 people, the practical matter is that unless everyone votes exactly the same way, you're pretty much limited to 3 people. And we only got 2. And this is criminal. I mean, it's criminal because there are so many qualified Negro Leaguers and pre-leaguers out there, including Bud Fowler as a pioneer. And why Bud, I'm thrilled Bud got in. I am absolutely thrilled Bud got in. I did not expect that. But why Rap Dixon and Dick Lundy and Cannonball Redding and Tubby Scales have to wait so we can vote in Bud Fowler is beyond me. There are probably 6 good ways of fixing this, in terms of having more elections, having a separate committee for the Black baseball and Negro Leaguers, in terms of expanding the ballot, in terms of stopping this ridiculous limit on the number of people you can vote for. There are lots of good ideas, but the Hall is, dug into its trench.
Gary, you're an expert probably the foremost expert on the Detroit Stars. And one candidate who received a number of votes, though not enough, was John Donaldson, who played, I believe, the 1919 season in Detroit.
He did, yeah.
Your thoughts on his candidacy, and is he one of those who was hurt by the system as you just described it, because he got enough votes, but not enough, and did he come up against those constraints?
I think so, but it's hard to tell. I mean, so much of what people think about Donaldson is because of his PR machine. It's Pete Gorton and the Donaldson Network. And I admire what Pete has done to boost Donaldson's candidacy, but this has sort of gone beyond the pale now, because there are people like Bob Costas talking about, he was on MLB Network, I believe, talking about how he didn't understand how Donaldson didn't get in. Well, Donaldson didn't get in because a lot of Negro League scholars don't think he's that great of a candidate. There are Negro League scholars who think, first, he shouldn't be put in as a player, because when you look at his stats against major Negro League teams and against minor league white teams, just not that good. They're not Hall of Fame worthy. You know, he spent most of his career pitching against semi-pro teams in the Midwest. And we have absolutely no idea how good these teams were. And I'm guessing most of them weren't very good. And so the Donaldson network, by blurring the line, you know, okay, so he's got 400 plus wins. I don't remember what his latest total is. And he's got 5,000 plus strikeouts. A lot of them were against high school ball players who guys who maybe played high school ball in, you know, Nowheresville, North Dakota, or Iowa or something like that. And of course, any good professional pitcher should mow them down. So shutting out some semi-pro team in the rural Midwest in the 1910s or the 1920s is no great accomplishment. So I think that Donaldson's not getting in wouldn't be surprising, except for the fact that he was the only candidate that had his own dedicated PR machine. You know, and the second thing is it probably was a numbers game. For whatever reason, the people on the committee decided they wanted to put in Bud Fowler and make a statement, and I'm glad they did. Of course, Buck was pretty much a guarantee. And then at that point, it's really hard to get a consensus around a third candidate. I mean, look at Dick Allen. Dick Allen failed by a few votes, right? Didn't he have 10 votes this year?
You know, he failed by one vote for the second time in a row.
One vote. Okay. So it's the same thing. It's a numbers game. You have 10 candidates, you have 16 people, you got to get 12 people to vote for you. It's just really hard to get more than 3 in there. And it's even hard to get 3. The other thing I would say about Donaldson is that there are people like me who believe he's a Hall of Famer. I believe he's a Hall of Famer. I would put him in as a pioneer. However, given the fact that the Hall doesn't respect the pioneer category, Dan may know the reason for this. About 20 some years ago, they abandoned it and they just lumped it in with pioneer and executive. And now they barely even use the pioneer label. They just call everybody who wasn't a player an executive. And they don't use pioneer for players who might not have been good enough to get in on their stats or their performance, but should be in there as a pioneer. Bud Fowler should be in there as a pioneer. There's no way to know whether he was a major league caliber ball player. I mean, no way to know.
Right.
And
no, I agree with you. The pioneer thing is just a really, it's just a really weird situation. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the ballot, because there's so many people that they used to only have the pioneers for people as a category, also for people that played in the 1800s. And you can't tell me that like Bill White is not a pioneer, you know, with, you know, him integrating MLB's front office and integrating the radio booth and all the stuff that he did. He should be a candidate as a pioneer, but he'll never see that until they change the rules, because they don't like, they think that only pioneers happen when the game was starting. I think the only real candidate that I've seen with the pioneer distinction in like the last decade or two was Doc Adams, and which makes sense because he's a pioneer. But it's just a real, it jumbles some things up for sure.
Right, and Dan just pointed out to another problem with the Hall of Fame is that they categorize people and they don't emphasize that you can vote for a person's total contribution as a player, manager, pioneer. You can do that.
It says that in the rules that you can, yeah. Yeah,
it says that you can, but try to find that in their public statements.
Right.
In the public statements, they emphasize player, manager, umpire, executive, and they've discarded pioneer. So for example, Gil Hodges, everyone talked about whether he was a Hall of Famer as a player. Very few people mentioned, some did, that you could elect him even if you thought he wasn't good enough as a player because of his managing the 69 Mets, which is a very big deal. The example I always use is Joe Torre. Joe Torre, in my view, was not a Hall of Fame player. And indeed, he was voted on 255 times, I think, and didn't make it. He was a Hall of Fame manager after winning 4 World Championships. But let's say Joe Torre retired or had a heart attack or something like that, and he only won 1 World Championship with the Yankees after 96, right? Now, is he a Hall of Fame manager? I think not, because his previous managerial career was long and not very distinguished. Is he a Hall of Fame player? Not. Would I put him in as a combined player and manager? You bet. It wouldn't take me 4 championships to elect him as a manager. I would have elected him as soon as he won his first World Championship with the Yankees based on his total contribution. And so, yeah, the Hall will tell you if you ask, and as Dan said, it's in the instructions, you can vote on a total contribution, but they always talk about player or manager. I mean,
Right.
Buck O'Neill's a classic one. He is not a Hall of Fame player, but he's what I call a perennial all-star. He is not a Hall of Fame manager because his managerial career almost exclusively was outside the major leagues. I think he took over the Monarchs in 48, meaning he had 1 year as a major league manager. However, he was a pioneering scout and a pioneering coach. And if the Hall of Fame gave a rat's ass about those categories, which they don't, they would recognize that. He was the first Black major league coach. That's a very big deal, especially given the way he was treated by the Cubs. And he was one of the first 3 or 5 full-time Black major league scouts, John Donaldson being another. To me, you combine that and then you add the icing on the cake, the Ken Burns thing and co-founder of the Negro League Baseball Museum, and essentially the guy who made it financially viable by raising money for it after Ken Burns made him an international star. That guy's a Hall of Famer 3 times over.
Absolutely.
But everyone focuses on, oh, gee, he wasn't a Hall of Fame player. Not everyone, but too many people.
Mitch, before we move on to some other enshrinees and candidates, I want to get your quick take, if we could, on Homerun Johnson. He's another 19th century player, another star for the Page Fence Giants. He was on the ballot, and I believe you think that he's a worthy Hall of Famer. I know you believe that about George Wilson as well. Wilson was not on the ballot, but Homerun Johnson got, I think it was 3 or fewer votes. I think they don't tell us how many, if it's less than 4. Is that discouraging because he got so few, or is it encouraging that the ballot gave him some exposure? Bud Fowler's in. Any kind of momentum for Homerun Johnson?
Yeah, I hope so. He was on the ballot. He was nominated in the 06, cattle call, as, Gary had mentioned, where they had the whole flood of people coming in. I think he's caught in the game. He was done right before the Negro Leagues. He lived to be, I think he died in 1963. I don't believe in any children, so there's nobody like passing on his legacy, kind of keeping it alive. I think one of his big claims is that he played in the same league, I believe, in Cuba in 1913 or 14 and out, slugged Ty Cobb and was the best player. And, that's kind of that lore. I'm just happy that he got some publicity and that means that the candidacy is still alive. I mean, he was a preeminent, Black baseball slugger for almost 20 years. I've read several snippets that said if you were going to organize a top flight team during that time frame from the 1890s, when he started, he was a teenager at Findlay. He's from Findlay, Ohio. He's a native there. So from the mid 1890s until, the 19 teens around World War I, he was the preeminent Black baseball slugger. Again, not enough data, no numbers, no war, all that kind of stuff. But I'm hopeful. I mean, when I started researching the Page Fence Giants, I'm not sure I ever heard the name Bud Fowler in 2015 or 2016, to be honest with you. And then all of a sudden I find all this stuff and I read Lang's book and there's not much on the internet. I'm trying to update the Page Fence Giants. I put some Bud Fowler stuff on his Wikipedia page a couple of weeks ago, anticipating that he might, he could possibly get in. So I'm going to kind of work on that with Grant Homerun Johnson. But if somebody wanted to argue he's not a viable candidate, I wouldn't shout him down. I don't think we know enough about this because we've so latched on to numbers that, yeah, you can he's got a void of numbers. I guess you could win by default. But I'm just like saying, if you've only got 5 or 6 travel major Negro League or pre-Negro League teams, and you're the best player, one of the best players for 15 years, and now we've said from 1920 the Negro Leagues are major leagues, then why wouldn't it suppose that the teams 5 and 6 years before would not have the same caliber of ball players? So I'm hopeful. I'm looking at a couple book projects, and Johnson might be one. I don't know. I got a lot of things in my head about some of this, but I'm just so gratified that Bud Fowler, I'm a high school history teacher, and this is like history. Like somebody went back 150 years ago and snatched his positive attributes and said, we're going to reward you now. So to me as a historian, I just think that's awesome. So, but yeah, I'm intrigued by Wilson as well. George Wilson, people are offering 50, 60 grand, to his services. Comiskey had some quote, which I can't find. I know Nathan asked her that. I can't put my hands on it, but I'm just intrigued that people take a second look at players, whether they're black, white, Latino, women. Look at them and say, in the context of their times, were they elite? Were they elite?
I just want to underscore your point there about, taking stock of the magnitude of the people who did get in. I mean, I was worried because of the numbers game that Gary was talking about. I was worried we'd have a smaller, non-existent class, and we have a lot of good names. The Dick Allen thing just has me baffled and frustrated, but other than that, this is a solid roster of enshrinees. We want to move on and talk about a few more, although Gary said he had a thought on Homerun Johnson. Gary, are you there, and do you want to weigh in on him?
Yeah, I'm here. When I'm writing notes about stuff people are saying about stuff I want to do, and then I'm looking away from the camera, so I turn it off temporarily. I was listening. Someone else advanced to me the idea that Johnson's candidacy may have been hurt by the fact that that people might not know Grant Johnson is Homerun Johnson, that they may confuse or not know that they're the same person. Now, I don't know if that's true, but actually, how many votes did he get? I thought, Mitch, you said he got less than 4, right? But I thought he got.
Here.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm double checking. Dowling, Johnson, and Redding each received 3 or fewer votes.
Okay, yeah. Well, then that wouldn't be enough. I mean, he might have gotten 3 more votes. It's still not enough. I mean, so someone else advanced that theory to me, and I think it makes sense that people, when a guy's got a nickname that becomes his name, Homerun Johnson, not everyone knows that Grant Johnson is Homerun Johnson. On the other hand, on this committee, everyone should have had that knowledge. I want to ask Dan something. Dan, did you talk to anyone who was on the committee since the vote?
I have not yet. No,
Yeah,
I was trying to talk to Leslie about it, but I haven't got a hold of her yet.
I talked to 2 people around the committee, and both of them said politely there wasn't a lot of knowledge in the room amongst the non-Negro League scholars. One of them said, to be helpful, that they were very receptive to what the Negro League scholars had to say. But I mean, to me, that's a bad election when what, half your electorate, was it? Half your electorate is dependent upon the other half to tell them how to vote.
Right.
Now, of course, the Negro League scholars aren't telling the BBWA writers and the other people, they aren't saying vote for this guy, but that's really what it is. You're by the way you shape the debate, and by the statistics you quote, and by the emphasis you put on different players, you are recommending to them who they should vote for because they don't know. And if they don't know, they shouldn't be on the damn committee.
Right.
So, and last thought on Johnson, I posted the link. Jay Jaffe, of course, does these excellent overviews of every candidate, and he did do one on Johnson, and he did say that he thinks Homerun Johnson is Hall of Fame caliber. So that's worth taking a look, at least for the merits of the case. Although, as you say, there are other things going on than just the merits of the case. But Dan, let's move on and talk about a Hall of Famer from our backyard here in West Michigan. With you being in Holland and right down the street is Zeeland. My grandparents are from Zeeland, Michigan. Otherwise, that's probably the only way I would have known where and what Zeeland was. But now it has a native son who's a Hall of Famer. Why do you think it took this long, and what do you think put him over the top this time?
All right. So before I get to that, just for everybody to know, in case they didn't know exactly how this went, the Golden Era Committee actually elected 4 players. Gary was talking about the numbers game, and the numbers game has hurt that era for so long that in the last 20 years, Ron Santo has been the only person elected from that era at all. And then to go from none to go to none, 3 of the last 4 elections have nobody make it at all, to having 4 candidates make the Hall of Fame, and Dick Allen missed by 1 vote. So they were 1 vote away from having the maximum 5 mathematically after being shut out is insane to me. So Minnie Minoso got 14 out of the 16 votes, and then you have to get 12 to make it. And right at 12 was Gil Hodges, Tony Oliva, and Jim Kaat. And Jim Kaat is from Zeeland, Michigan, as Nathan said, and he's the sixth person from Michigan to be elected to the Hall of Fame, and the others are Charlie Gehringer and Hal Newhouser, Ted Simmons, John Smoltz, and Kai Kyler. That is not counting Jeter, since he was technically born in New Jersey, although he grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So that's a big deal to have another Michigan Hall of Famer. Baseball in Michigan is a big deal. It's not the same quite as some of the southern states, but that's definitely a big deal. But I've written a few things about this because he's obviously in my coverage area as the sports editor of the Holland Sentinel, and Zeeland is the next door town. But the biggest thing is just the wait for these guys. Jim Kaat waited 32 years since he first got on the ballot, and it was elected last week. And of the 4 guys in the Golden Era Committee, his wait was the shortest of all 4, with Minnie Minoso technically waiting 35 years, although if you count his first time on the ballot in 1969, before he came back, he was on the ballot one time, got like 1% of the vote. Then he came back a bunch of times and he wasn't on the ballot again until 1986. But Tony Oliva, 43 years, Gil Hodges, 53 years. And we can talk a little bit about each of them, in a second. But Jim Kaat from Zeeland, I've, gotten the chance to know him over the years quite a bit. And he definitely had a borderline case. And he would acknowledge that. He said that he never thought he'd be elected to the Hall of Fame. For those of you who don't know his numbers by heart, he has 283 wins, 16 Gold Glove awards. His ERA's 3.4. His WAR is, in the low 50s. A lot of naysayers would call him a compiler, in the in the same lines as like Harold Baines, because he pitched for 25 years. But I think there's a lot of reasons that it took him so long. The first is being his numbers are borderline, like I would have voted for him, but if I had 4 votes, if I had 4 votes objectively, even being from his town, he would have been the 5th or 6th person I would have voted for on that group. I definitely would have voted for Minnie Minoso. Number 1, he was my number 1 omission. And we'll get into that, in a second, but I would have voted for Tony Oliva. I would have voted for Dick Allen. I would have voted for Ken Boyer, and then Gil Hodges, Jim Kaat would have been the next 2. So, and I would have voted for all of them if it was a yes/no situation. But I think one thing that has hurt him lately is the fact that his, some players, their metrics make them in advanced metrics make them look way better. Like they make Dick Allen look as he should, way better. They made Lou Whitaker help him look better. They made Burt Blyleven look way better. That does not happen for Jim Kaat. The metrics do not make him look better. They make him possibly look slightly worse, but slightly worse than a strong borderline candidate is still a borderline candidate. One of the biggest things that I think has come into play with all these waits of years, especially for Kaat, is that he hung on a long time. He hung on a long time because to win that World Series title. He won with the 82 Cardinals. A lot of people don't remember that he was on the 82 Cardinals. He hung on to win that title and was a relief pitcher his last few years. A lot of things happened that just didn't improve his candidacy those last few years as a relief pitcher. But if one of the biggest factors to me in the wait is, and Joe Posnanski wrote a really good column about this years ago, is that if he didn't hang on and become a relief pitcher, if he retired when he had like 250 wins, he'd be in the Hall of Fame already. And his reasoning was that if that was the case, he would have hit the ballot. With the time he would have hit the ballot, he would have been the best starting pitcher on the ballot. And that is something that always gains attention. The best starting pitcher on the ballot always gets a ton of support. So what happened is he waited, got his World Series, and then when he hit the ballot with 283 wins, the other people on the ballot were Tom Seaver, Steve Carlton, Phil Niekro, Don Sutton, Fergie Jenkins, and Blyleven, and eventually Nolan Ryan. It led into this golden era of pitchers all hit the ballot together in a matter of years. And instead of being first where he already got the support and then the other guys come in, he came in after them and everybody goes, wow, Jim Kaat was great, but he was the 14th best pitcher from his own era because it was the golden era of pitching. And, everybody, I think there's 12 maybe pitchers from that era, 12 or 13 pitchers from that era that either have 300 wins or 3,000 strikeouts. That's insanity. You're not going to, and that's not including guys that hit the ballot in the middle of that too, like Don Drysdale, that did not have either one of those things, but eventually made the Hall of Fame. And it's just a weird instance of timing with him. So that I think is the main reason he had to wait so long. Because if he made it, back then in the early 90s or something, people wouldn't have been talking about his metrics making him look worse or whatever like that. They would have been talking about him as one of the great starting pitchers of his era, which he was. So 283 wins is nothing to sneeze at. 1965 on the Twins, he pitched 3 World Series starts against Sandy Koufax and beat him in one of those starts. That was kind of his big moment. 1966, the next year, he was the best pitcher in the American League, but the Cy Young Award was only 1 per all of baseball at the time, not 1 per league, and Sandy Koufax got that. I think that had he officially won a Cy Young Award, I think that also would have swayed voters and would have recognized him as, being one of the elites of the game. So I think that was a big factor as well. And sorry, I'm rambling on, and I can, talk about other candidates in a second, but Nathan, I want to let you jump in.
Yeah, no, that's a great breakdown. I appreciate that. I just want to land one more time on the fact of having a Michigan Hall of Famer, because you mentioned the list and it's not very long. And you're someone who's interested in the Hall of Fame. You worked at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And so you're usually covering this as a large national story. And now we have someone in your backyard. Now, as you mentioned, it's a relatively marginal candidate, not someone you're banging the drum for like you were for Minnie Minoso. But just what does it mean? Well, what's it like to have covered Cooperstown and now have a story in your backyard, a Hall of Famer from down the road?
I mean, it's wild, to be honest. I mean, I've been studying Hall of Fame elections since I was like 15. We used to go to Cooperstown every year. My family had some like a summer cabin in the Catskills. My dad's family that lived in New York City, we would go every year and hit Cooperstown on the way back. And it was this big deal. And I started getting interested in, who's really in and why aren't some people in and all that kind of stuff. And then, so I've been studying the election, and Kaat, as part of that, was on the ballot at that point. So I've been studying these guys, all of these guys that made it this year since then. The first time I met Buck O'Neill was in like 1998 when he came through Ann Arbor and I don't know exactly what it was, but he came through Ann Arbor, met Tony Oliva that year. It just became this big, I dare say obsession in the positive way. But to have watched his candidacy, and now I've been at the Holland Sentinel for like almost 18 years now. So all of his near misses I've been covering. So for those of you who don't know, the last time they voted on this was 6 years ago. It's supposed to be every 5, but they postponed last year because of COVID, because they didn't want to do the in-person meeting. So 6 years ago, Minnie Minoso missed by 4 votes. Jim Kaat missed by 2 votes. Dick Allen and Tony Oliva each missed by 1 vote. And now Dick Allen missed by 1 vote again, which is the one tragedy of this. I mean, it's not a tragedy if he gets elected in 5 years, but the one really almost keeping it from being a perfect game situation. And Kaat missed by 2 votes last time, 3 the time before, 2 the time before that. So like, I've had to cover this from a near miss perspective for over a decade. And again, it's a weird thing because like, I never thought he was the best guy in the ballot. So, and he never thought, that's the best part. He never thought he was the best guy in the ballot. He was pushing for his teammate, Tony Oliva. He was pushing for other guys. But to finally have that happen, it's definitely a very big deal. I mean, I have people in town ask me all the time, when's Jim Kaat going to get in the Hall of Fame? When's Jim Kaat going to get in the Hall of Fame? And I always tell them, 6 years ago, I thought it was it. I thought that was the best chance. It helped, obviously, having who the committee is. People had a lot of grief about who was on the committee when Harold Baines was elected, because it was kind of like LaRussa was on there, his old manager, his own old owner was on there and everything like that. This committee was lined up to elect people. Bert Blyleven was on the committee. He was a teammate. Rod Carew, he was a teammate. Mike Schmidt, he was a teammate of Dick Allen and Jim Kaat. You know, like they lined up. It was lined up for them to get 5 guys in, and they almost did, which is incredible given the weight we've had with nobody continuing to make it. But to be able to cover that story locally and see the excitement of people around town that have been asking me for over a decade, well, when is he going to get in? When is he going to get in? And I think I also think that he and Gil Hodges specifically might possibly be the last stand in the traditional versus analytics. You know, I feel like Jack Morris was a backlash candidate in that regard, where, you know, traditional and old Hall of Famers that were on the committee were like, yeah, but he was the best of his time. You know, I don't care what your analytics say. You know, analytics also say Rick Russell was maybe the best pitcher of the 1980s, which if anybody actually believes that Rick Russell was the best pitcher of the 1980s, we're going to need to have a talk. But I think I agree that analytics are a really good tool and they should be used. But for something like analytics, they should show us who's been overlooked. But for that to totally be a factor of, oh, now I think Kevin Apier is a Hall of Famer because his WAR was better than a lot of guys. No thanks. But anyway, sorry, I get off topic. But Jim Kaat, just being able to cover it, being able to physically text him and be like, congratulations, you finally made it. That was super fun. I didn't say you finally made it like that because that would have been in poor taste the way I would have written that. But that's basically what I was saying. But to be able to watch that and have everything affect him too, based on his relationship with other people. I mean, like it was hard not to almost, like, for any baseball fan, if you guys haven't watched the video of Tony Oliva getting the call after 43 years. Now, unlike Kaat, he knew he should be in the Hall of Fame. We all knew he should be in the Hall of Fame. He had a better Hall of Fame case than Jim Kaat. He was one of the best. He was arguably in the argument for best player in the American League for a whole decade. To see him finally get that call after thinking it was coming several times, you know, it's hard not to get a little even emotional about that. So, but to have it be in the backyard, and especially coming the year after, like Jeter was elected, he's from Kalamazoo. I mean, I know he was born in New Jersey, but he grew up in Kalamazoo. That's in West Michigan. And then he made it the same year as Ted Simmons, who's from Michigan. So Michigan's Hall of Fame population in 2 years almost doubled. And that is incredible because, I mean, you get people don't think of Charlie Gehringer and Hal Newhouser as Michigan Hall of Famers. They think of them as Detroit Tigers Hall of Famers, and everything they think about them is tied to the Tigers, which is fine because that's obviously where they played their careers. And there's kind of that blurred line there. But the only player to make, the only two otherwise have been John Smoltz, which is, again, people remember him for being traded away from the Tigers. But which I still maintain, everybody gives me a hard time. That was the best trade the Tigers ever made. Everybody's like, why would you say that? They got a Hall of Famer. Doyle Alexander went 9-0 and they won the division by 1 vote. They needed every one of his wins and they needed every one of his things. So from their standpoint, they got exactly what they wanted, the best possible. Now, of course, in hindsight, was it the best trade? Of course not, but you never know that with the prospects. But before Smoltz, the only non-Tiger Michigan Hall of Famers, Kai Kyler. People don't even know that. When I was a kid, I thought his name was Kiki Kyler. I didn't even know how you said that, why you said that, and all that kind of stuff. And nobody knows anything about him. People thought that, you know, his name was Kai Kyler because he had a stutter. That's not the case. People used to just chant his name, Kyler, and they started going Kai from his young days. And it had nothing to do with growing up in Michigan. It had nothing to do with anything. And it had nothing to do with any sort of speech impediment, which was the story going around about 10 or 15 years ago. But that's it. And people don't know anything about him. He's from Harrisville, Michigan, which is in, like, you know, the most remote part of Michigan that no one goes to. I mean, even people go to the Upper Peninsula because people go there to experience the Upper Peninsula. Nobody goes to the side of the pointer finger above the thumb for any reason whatsoever, you know, so nobody goes there. It's not a thing. There's a Kai Kyler restaurant in Harrisville, Michigan, but it's not owned by his family. It's just, hey, this is the only thing that anyone's ever known about Harrisville, Michigan, so we're going to put it on a restaurant. So having this slew of Michigan ties the last couple of years has been huge, and especially to get some non-Tiger Michigan ties is a big deal.
For those of you who are tuning in and joining us, we appreciate you listening live. And before we wrap up the Hall of Fame portion, we want to invite you to post in the chat your questions or comments. Who in the class are you excited about? What questions do you have about the process? Who were the biggest snubs? If you want to speak your question and pose it to our panel, we invite you to do that. Dan, let me come back to you real quickly one more time, because you've been interested in the Hall of Fame for a while. You've also been interested in researching the Negro Leagues, and we kind of have a convergence of that this year with Buck O'Neil and Minnie Minoso and the others getting in. For you, is O'Neil and Minoso, are those the biggest headliners, given that context of the Negro Leagues ascent in historians' view the recent years?
Definitely, and it shows by the voting. They both led their committees in voting. I think that for Minnie Minoso to jump up as he did was a big deal. So I'm okay with everybody who made it. Don't get me wrong. I would have voted for all of them, and I would have voted for Dick Allen, and I would have voted for Ken Boyer on that, on the Golden Ear ballot. I agree with Gary that one of my votes on the early ballot would have definitely gone to Cannonball Dick Redding, and that was kind of a shame to see him get fewer than 3 votes. I didn't expect him to necessarily make it, but that was a little bit of a bummer. And of course, Dick Allen missing by 1 vote for the second time in a row was a big bummer. But I mentioned Tony Oliva was one of the best players in the 60s. From 62 or 63 to 73. There's very few players not in the Hall of Fame that were arguably or at least in the conversation for greatest player in the game for a decade. And so for him to make that's a really big deal. 3 batting titles, and WAR and all the analytics he's the only candidate they did nothing for. They didn't help his cause, they didn't hurt his cause. He was still a great player that didn't play long enough to get in easily. So which was really interesting to me that happened. Gil Hodges, that's a big deal. Love the fact that his widow is alive, 95 years old, still living in the house in Brooklyn that they lived in when he joined the Dodgers. Like she's lived in the house since like 1949. I love that, that she got to get that call for him. He's obviously a borderline candidate as well. But Gil Hodges in 1983 got 64% of the writers' vote. That's insanity that didn't end up in an election. It was his last year on the ballot. He got 60% 4 times. Besides Jack Morris, when he was still on the ballot, he and Jack Morris were the only players to get over 50% of the vote and not make it. And then Jack Morris made it, and Gil Hodges was the only one to make it 50% and not make it. So now everyone who's ever gotten 50% has made it. And he got 64%, which is insanely close on the writer's ballot. So very, very good to see that too. But I want to get to Minoso. Minnie Minoso is by far the biggest omission of the Hall of Fame for me in a long time. And that is because people don't realize that, people kind of know that, oh, he played in the Negro Leagues and then he played in the Major Leagues. Some people know that. Some people don't really get exactly how that was. People think that Roberto Clemente was the pioneering Black Latino baseball player. Now, he was the most important and he was the best, Clemente. I'm not taking anything away from that. But Minoso was an all-star 7 years before Clemente reached the Major Leagues. Minoso was the pioneer. Tony Oliva called him our Jackie Robinson when he was talking about him the other day. To deal with the racism of being Black during the integration era, and then also not speak the language and have nobody else like that. He was really one of the only players that was a Spanish speaker in the Major Leagues for several years. And to have him go out and play the way he did at a Hall of Fame level. Now, his numbers are kind of borderline. Adding his Negro League numbers make it look even better. Analytics help make him look even better because he was a corner outfielder that wasn't necessarily a power hitter. So analytics are showing how much, how well-rounded of a player he was. He won some Gold Gloves. He was a 9-time All-Star, which is, to me, would be enough anyway for him to be in the Hall of Fame. But the fact that he was the true Black Latino pioneer that ushered in this era of Clemente and Oliva and Louis Tiant and all these guys that came afterward, Orlando Cepeda, that changed the game, Tony Perez. This is a huge deal. And a lot of people didn't really understand that part of it or really see that part of it. They didn't think of him the same way as Jackie Robinson or Larry Doby or Campanella or even Don Newcomb or people like that. But to me, his contribution was so much more. And I've known this about, and felt this way about him for at least a decade when I put this all together when I was old enough to kind of figure it out, and probably more than a decade. So he's been my number one omission from the Hall of Fame because of his place in history and how big of a deal that is for the game. And he kind of brings everything full circle to the game. He's played in the Negro Leagues, which is a big deal that people are looking at now differently. But he also was the Latino pioneer. So he's Negro Leagues, he's Latino, he's Major Leagues, he's everything. And there's only one person that was everything like that, that kind of blazed so many trails at once. So that, to me, that was the most gratifying, in the sense that, to me, you can argue which players deserve it or not, and the other guys that made it deserve it. But to have that element of such a pioneer and trailblazer, there's no other player that has played in the last 80 years that has anything like that that's not already in the Hall of Fame. So to me, that has changed the course of, people remembering him as a pioneer, because they will, more people will understand that now that he's in the Hall of Fame, and that they've kind of made a big deal out of that. So that the other players made it, that's great. But the fact that he meant so much more to baseball than anybody that's played, than anybody that's not been in the Hall of Fame. You know what I mean? It's hard to argue he meant more to baseball than like Cal Ripken. You could make that argument for sure, but of the last 80 years, he's the only player that had that level of impact on and off the field. So that righted the biggest wrong, in my opinion.
So we don't have the occasion today to talk about deserving Tigers who belong in the Hall of Fame. We plan to come back to the Hall of Fame and focus on that. It's on SABR Day in February, so stay tuned for that. But I do have to ask, Dan, for you to set the table for 2022. Lou Whitaker is back on the ballot. He deserves it. How can they keep keeping him out? We don't have time to delve into that, but that is coming now.
I can be quick on this. There's 2 points I want to make about the Tigers now. The fact that the first fact is, going back to this golden era, you had 4 players make it in almost 5 after almost one person has made it in over 20 years. What this is going to do, I almost guarantee you that the next time this era comes up, Bill Freehand's going to be a finalist now. That committee, because nobody has made it in 20 years, it's been such a logjam. It's been the same 9 guys, and the 10th guy has rotated around. And there's a chance Mickey Lolich is a finalist on there too. Now, metrics don't do him as much justice as they do Bill Freehand, but I would guarantee you that Bill Freehand is a finalist the next time around, because there's finally 4 spots, and not just who can we throw in that's not going to be anywhere near these top 5 guys. So we're going to go into a ballot where Dick Allen should make it. The next best guy on there is going to be Ken Boyer. He's going to get a really good look. But now there's going to be this group of who's going to be the 4 that jump onto that committee. Freehand should be on there. Kurt Flood should be on there. It could be Vada Pinson. It could be Jimmy Wynn. It could be a lot of players that haven't really got a good shake as far as the Hall of Fame is concerned. It could be Mickey Lolich as well. So there's a lot of factors. So that's a huge deal for Tigers fans that anyone got elected, because that will help that happen. And Jay Jaffe has written a lot about that too, wanting to see Freehand be one of the people on the ballot. So that's a big deal. Next year is actually today's game is next year. So Fred McGriff and Kenny Lofton should be the new people on that ballot next year. Lou Piniella, the manager, missed by 1 vote the last time, so I'm sure he'll be a candidate on there too. There'll be guys like Oral Hershiser, Kevin Brown, David Cohn, those kind of players. So a lot of different players. I would put my money on Fred McGriff making it, and possibly Kenny Lofton. But then in 2 years, Lou Whitaker is back on the ballot, and he will benefit the same way for the fact that last time he was on the ballot, Marvin Miller and Ted Simmons made it. So that's 2 people out. So Lou Whitaker and Dave Parker and Dwight Evans are the 3 leading returning vote getters. So, and it'll be the old versus the new. The old stat guys are going to love Dave Parker and put a lot into him. The new stat guys are going to put the same amount of effort into Lou Whitaker and Dwight Evans, because they're kind of the poster children now for analytics, now that Tim Raines has made it. Lou Whitaker has kind of become the de facto poster child for analytics. So I think what's going to happen is he's going to get a really huge and a really good shake this time around. And he's going to, if he doesn't make barely, I would guess he'll either barely make it or barely miss. And then when their group meets every 3 years, and then he'll, if he doesn't make it in 2 years, I think he makes it in 5.
Although, I mean, God bless him. As far as we know, he's fully healthy, but he is in his 60s, and
Right.
you know, boy, we got to get him in before, while he's still there to celebrate it. Although, you know, we wish him many years of great health. But yeah, your point. That's the great thing about a big class like this year. So it's great to have a big class. It's great for those inductees, and it's great for the people who are on the outside looking in, because they get that much closer to the doorstep. Before we move on and talk about the Tigers offseason, Gary, a last thought on Jim Kaat? And Gary may
Yeah,
have
thank you. I'm here. I just want to say that I think that people underestimate the amount of value that hardware has on the Hall of Fame elections. I know there are all these formulas and systems, and they're very good. JAWS and the black ink, gray ink thing, and the Hall of Fame metrics. But I think amongst traditional voters, and we're just now at the turning point where traditional voters are fading from, let's say, the dominant voting bloc. Hardware is really important. So when you get guys like Kaat who never won a Cy Young, that's a real handicap. And I put in the chat that Dan mentioned back when you only had one Cy Young award, he lost out to Sandy Koufax. Well, so would everybody else, right?
Right.
But when Pete Palmer and I did our baseball encyclopedia for Barnes and Noble and ESPN, 15 years ago, we did ex post facto awards, and we did them for every major award for all years, going back to 1871. They were much more comprehensive than the old total baseball hypothetical awards. We gave Kaat the 66 AL ex post facto Cy Young. And I think, it wouldn't necessarily have meant him that he got in earlier, but it might have, because people really do value those awards. The same way as time passes, people forget how great Bob Feller was. And partly that's because there's no film or video of him. I mean, there is, but there's not much. So you can't see him up on MLB.com anytime you want, or you can't see much of him. And partly that's because he didn't win any Cy Young awards, right? Now, if you look, we gave him 4 ex post facto Cy Young awards. If you factor in the war years when he was absolutely dominant, he might have won 2 more. And if you could go around saying that Bob Feller had won 6 Cy Young awards, people now would think a lot more about his historical greatness. Same way with Ty Cobb. Ty Cobb has been dissed for, 40 years now, since Bill James first trashed him and said he wasn't that good. Chris Speaker might have been better. And other people thought that, other people like Craig Wright thought Honus Wagner was a better player. I don't buy any of that. If you look at it, Cobb was a dominant player of the dead ball era, and everyone at the time knew it. And people thought Wagner and Speaker were great, but not as good as Cobb. So Cobb only has 1 MVP award. Why? Because A, they didn't give MVP awards every year in his career, and B, once you won one, the people wouldn't vote for you again. There's either a rule or it was just a practice.
Yeah, Babe Ruth only has 1 also.
Right. We gave Cobb 4 ex post facto MVPs. You add that to his Chalmers Award, that's 5. Until guys like Barry Bonds came around, 5 MVP awards puts you in a pretty damn select group. It still does. So I think that, the lack of hardware for pitchers before the Cy Young was given out in each league, and the lack of hardware for players before the BBWA started awarding a recognized MVP award for every year, and no one was screwing around with, he won it last year, we're not going to vote for him this year. That's really, I think, a hidden factor in some Hall of Fame, players in how and when they got in.
I agree. And even when you look at some more recent cases, so there's a good case to be made that Alan Trammell missing out on the 1987 MVP, that's what caused him to have to wait so long. Barry Larkin got in very easily. I don't know if it was like second ballot. Why Larkin so easily and Trammell had so much difficulty? Larkin got the MVP, and I think it was 95. Trammell missed out infamously to George Bell. Lou Whitaker was never a serious MVP candidate. That probably hurt him. That kind of stuff does seem to matter with voters. It does make me question. We got to move on. But Dan, I really want to ask you this because I've been wondering about this. So we talked about the triumph of analytics in Hall of Fame voting. Tim Raines, I think Larry Walker, the guys like that are elevated by analytics. Lou Whitaker certainly is. And yet, so many of these cases come up before these committees full of Tony La Russa and Jerry Reinsdorf voting on Harold Baines. So does the triumph of analytics stop at that point, or is there spillover effect that maybe some of the other members are swayed by that?
Right. I think there's a lot of obviously mixed bag results with these committees, and I think that you're getting every level of it. If you're an analytics person, you're getting these people in, or Dick Allen's almost in. Dick Allen. Just for a little stat for everybody, he is the only player not in the Hall of Fame to have led the league in WAR for a 10 full year period. If that doesn't show you how dominant he was, I don't know what will. So you're getting Trammell. They're getting the Trammels, the Tim Raines, Larry Walker, like you said. Bert Blyland was one of their first big poster children, but I'm not really sure why, because he won 287 games and had 3,000 strikeouts. So I'm not really sure why that had to be an analytics push, but it was. But then they're also getting Jack Morris and Jim Kaat and Gil Hodges. And on the next ballot, you're going to have, guys like McGriff, and then guys like the next one with Whitaker. You'll have people like Whitaker and Evans that are finalists and big time, analytics based guys, but then you'll also have Dale Murphy, Dave Parker, Mattingly, those guys too, who also all won MVPs. So that comes into play as well. So I think that everybody, like a lot of people that I've talked to in some groups that I belong to as far as Hall of Fame chatter and stuff, they, for everybody that's upset, they're also really thrilled about somebody. So it's kind of a full mixed bag. So for every time they think they're watering it down with somebody, that's also helping other people get in too. So I think that it's going to continue to be like that for a while, for another, at least 5 years in the ballot, in any kind of ballot, the writers or any of these era ballots. I think that there's going to be, I think the kind of the pushback is over. I don't think, I feel like Jack Morris was kind of a pushback candidate. And I think that people could see Kaat as that, but that's not his argument. Excuse me. 283 wins isn't his argument. It's not quite a pushback in that regard, but I think we're getting to that point now where it's going to be, I think the last stand for that group is going to come with Dave Parker and Dale Murphy and those guys. And then we'll see what goes from there. But this new group is going to have David Cohn, who analytics make look really good, Kevin Brown, Hershiser, all these pitchers that are, right around 200 wins, but wins isn't the definitive thing anymore. So I think that's, McGriff is 7 homers away from 500. So again, I don't think that's a pushback candidate. So I think in the modern eras, there's not any more pushback. I think analytics is going to help drive that and be the driving force with that. I think there's, a couple of the older groups, there will be a little bit of pushback in that, because if analytics was driving the old stuff, Bill Dahlin would have made it, because Bill Dahlin has the best analytics of anybody not in the Hall of Fame. And he also has pretty good traditional stats for a shortstop, even if he played in the 1890s and early 1900s, and he got 3 or less votes. So
Rogelio makes the point in the chat, Whitaker's numbers after the age of 32, one of his best seasons. And that's one thing that I don't think people fully appreciate about Whitaker. Rogelio's written about this. It's not just, he never won the MVP, but he hung around to compile, 19 seasons. He didn't just hang around. He was productive and notable in the 1990s. And so no, he didn't get to 3,000 or anything like that. But I think you could say he had a lot better, 90 through 95 than Trammell did. And that's one underrated aspect about a very underrated player, and even now underrated Hall of Fame candidate. We'll talk more about Lou Whitaker on SABR Day. I promise. A lot more.
We got plenty. There's plenty of angles to go with.
We're just warming up, but we have to move on to the off season.